My name is Alexandra Fuller.
Hello, my name is James Sueur. As an historian of decolonization and post-colonialism, I have considered the role of the writer, the artist, and the intellectual in great detail. It is for this reason that I asked to interview Alexandra Fuller. At the time of filming the interview that's going to follow, she had just published her third book, The Legend of Colton H. Bryant, and she was in the process of writing her fourth book, which has now just been published as Cocktail Hour Under the Tree of Forgetfulness. She came onto the international scene of writers with a groundbreaking and very important autobiographical account of growing up in colonial Rhodesia, Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight, which was followed by an international bestseller, Scribbling the Cat. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Alexandra Fuller. What were the origins of your desire to write?
I grew up on the eastern part of Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, and in those, during the Civil War started in 1974, which is when we moved to that part of the country. I mean, the Civil War really got heated up then, I guess I should say. And in order to get to any of the schools that were around there, we had to travel over dirt roads that often had landmines in them. And so for the first couple of years, until I was old enough to be away from home, my mother taught me on the farm, and we would get these correspondence packets from Salisbury, which was then the capital of Rhodesia. And my mother would just throw out the math papers. She just thought it was so boring. But we would spend hours over the storytelling. And it was really my mother, I think, that instilled in me this idea that the ordinary, what we did every day, was worthy of stories. And so I think I think almost without knowing that I was being coached as a writer, she instilled that in me. And my mother is a very literate, very smart, book-loving person. And she has no discrimination when it comes to the books she loved whatsoever, which is interesting because she has a lot of discrimination in her politics. But growing up, she was very attracted to some of the books that were banned and very interested in reading. Doris Lessing, for example, had been banned by then. But my mother has a sort of insatiable curiosity, and she's somehow able to separate out her own politics from this sort of voracious appetite to read everything and anything that came into her hands. And I think she really wanted she had grown up in Kenya, and so she, the influence of Beryl Markham and Isaac Dinesen weighed very heavily on her. My grandfather was a contemporary of Beryl Markham's, and I had raced horses with her and so on. And I think my mother really thought that she had lived a biography-worthy life, and she doesn't have the discipline to write herself, but I think she thought that having a writer in the family wouldn't be a bad idea.
Knowing that, what was your reaction when she read her biography?
She was furious. Yeah, that was not what she was expecting. I think, we all have a myth of ourselves, and my mother's myth of herself is that she's, that having been said, I think we have a myth of ourselves for a good reason, that living within a myth helps us to survive sometimes quite difficult situations, or helps us live with, if we've got lousy politics, you can live with the myth that you're fighting for freedom or something, when really you're part of an institution that supports apartheid, which is what my mother was doing. But the myth of herself, I think, was that, and in part this is a myth based on truth, like most myths are, that she's this incredibly resilient, very glamorous woman, terrifyingly fearless. I mean, I've never met anybody who so blindly will fight for what she believes is true. And so I think when Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight came out, and she read what she looked like from her child's perspective, it really undid her. And it took me it took me until 3 minutes ago to have compassion for how she must have felt reading that, because from my perspective, I thought I'd written a very compassionate portrait of a very complicated woman. But I think from her perspective, we all want the myth of ourselves to be generated. We don't want to see ourselves as we truly are. And I think sometimes, I have, again, though, to my mother's credit, she's at last forgiven me for writing that book. And she even laughs out loud, she'll sort of find it quite funny, and she'll say, I'm completely crazy, and you should read this book and find out exactly how crazy I am. She likes to tell people she's just met, And I also think that the longer she's lived with the idea of the book, the more she accepts that, so this is my perspective, it's not hers.
Mm-hmm. What about your father? How did he react?
He didn't read the book.
Why?
I don't think he's that interested, really. He is, he'd be furious if he heard me say this, but he's the most profoundly Buddhist man I've ever met without having the slightest inkling of what that means. He absolutely lives in the moment he's in. He doesn't see the point of looking back at all. Calls it a post-mortem. Don't know why you have to have a post-mortem.
Is that because of the war?
I'm sure it's because of the war, a very difficult childhood in England. He was raised sort of gentrified English, couldn't wait to leave. The pretense and the sort of the quiet violence of that class system, I think, just appalled him. He is a profoundly gracious human being in terms of his absolutely unable to discriminate against other human beings. And that sounds sort of crazy given that he fought on the white side of the Rhodesian War, but I don't think he did it because he was white or anyone else wasn't white. He did it because the war was there and he wasn't going to let somebody else take his place. But he treats everybody as an equal. I mean, the Queen or a villager who maybe cannot read and write, but to my father, they're the same person. I mean, he's sort of extraordinary that way. And I think from him I learned a kind of impatience with sentimentality. He's the least sentimental person I've ever met. He also is terrifying. He's very taciturn, very stoical, very uncomplaining. And he's absolutely not scared of dying or, the things that ordinary men are afraid of, my father finds boring and irrelevant.
Did he read the second book?
He did read the second book and found that boring. I said he was about 3/4 of the way through Scribbling the Cat, and by that stage in the book, I'm on an island with 3 war veterans and a lion, and I have to sleep in a cage because this fully grown, somewhat domesticated lion doesn't sleep in a cage, and things are sort of unraveling fast and furiously in the book. And I said to Dad, how's the book coming? He says, if something doesn't happen soon, I'm going to put this thing down.
And your sister? And what does she think about these?
She didn't read Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight either. For one thing, my mother said anyone who reads this book, my mother's a bit like George W. Bush. You're either for her or against her. And so if you read the book, then you were against her, and then you weren't going to be popular. And she made that very clear. So she read the book first, and she said, anyone in this family who reads that book, I'll never speak to them again. She's so terrifying. So I'm sure that's half the reason my dad refused to read the first book. And my sister wouldn't read it, in part because I think she's 3 years older than me, and I think some of the things that happened to us growing up were painful for her in a way that I'm not sure. Well, we're very different too. I'm the sort of person who, if there's an elephant in the room, is going to say, you know what, guys, there's an elephant in the room. My sister's going to, feed the elephant. We're just different in that way. In that way, she's more a product of my family than I am. I've always been slightly the black sheep. But for her, she just said, I lived it. I think that was enough. Anyway, then the book came out on tape, and my sister doesn't read either. We're very different that way. She's an artist. She really doesn't read much at all. And so her excuse when I said, you've got to read the book, is, I'm illiterate. Mum's always saying I'm illiterate. Brain damaged, my mother's always saying. So my mother can be incredibly harsh. But I gave the book to Vanessa on tape, and she read it, and she said, it's great. You make us sound almost normal.
When you began the process of writing the book, how important?
Which book?
The first book, Don't Let's Go to Dogs.
Yeah.
How traumatic for you was the violence of the war?
Okay, so I think one of the things that's central to that book isn't so much the violence outside, it's the violence within. Okay. And I think that was something that women writers tend to address, African women writers tend to address more than perhaps some of the African men. Although, having said that, I think Marechera does a beautiful job of exploring the way that violence gets turned inward when that first sacred "thou shalt not kill," once that's been violated, everything else is up for grabs. And so the way that I felt that book, and I hope that the way that I wrote it, is that the guerrilla violence and the violence coming from the other side, which was the side my parents were fighting for, was a constant. You're always expecting to get attacked. It's very much a part of your daily experience. You're constantly on edge. We were all certainly in the rural areas subject to ambushes or attacks on the farms. My boarding school got mortared a couple of times. And it's, that is terrifying, and but in a way it's outside of you, and so you're terrified, but it's not in a way that you can't escape from. What was much worse was the way that violence trickled into the home, the kind of domestic violence, the way I think that soldiers pervert their aggression against women. And I think we're seeing that most certainly in the Congo now. Rape is a massive weapon of war. And the Rhodesian War was no different, rape on both sides. And then that trickles down to the way that, particularly young women are treated as a commodity by soldiers. And I think that's what happens when you give a 17 or 18-year-old boy a gun and tell him that whatever he points that gun at is his. And I think it becomes an extension of that. I think that permission comes without a caveat. If you can kill women and children, is it such a big step to rape them? And so, that for me was the most difficult thing to write about, and the thing that I've most has been hardest, I think, for people to accept who read the book, that I named names, and I, talked about at least 2 occasions of molestation, one that happened to my sister and one that happened to myself. And first of all, it's a very taboo thing to talk about, probably anywhere, but in Southern Africa, incredibly taboo, which has allowed this to go on and on and on. Secondly, the communities there are so small, so within the white community, to sort of out somebody else for molesting a child is just considered a traitor. You're being a traitor. And a number of people said to me, why did you have to name names? How could you have done that to him? And what about his children? So there's a culture, I think, of protecting the men who do those sorts of things, because it has so institutionalized, and it comes with the same territory as civil war. So for me, that was by far the more important story to tell. If I look at Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight, a lot more so than Scribbling the Cat, it's what happens around a tea table during war. It's not what happens out in the bush where all the obvious fighting is. And I think that we are seeing this in South Africa. It's got the highest rate of rape in the world. Violence against women is just phenomenal. But it's not just women, it's children, it's babies. And so for me, that's where the real story happens, where the violence trickles down. and there's no escape. And the very men who are supposed to be protecting you are violating you. And then the lines get incredibly blurry. And so Scribbling the Cat was my effort to explore that. And what's interesting, I'm glad you asked that question, because a lot of people, you know, who read Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight gloss over I mean, and it's not like it's a huge point in the book, but they gloss over this issue of violence, but more particularly the issue of internal violence that happens. And if you read Alexandra Kanangoni's absolutely spectacular Echoing Silences, very short book, very it's supposedly fiction, but I have a fairly good idea that it's very autobiographical, and he writes exactly about he's writing from the guerrilla point of view. He was fighting for ZANU-PF, in Mozambique was his theatre of war, and he writes also about the way that violence turned inward onto women and children.
When you decided to write the Scribbling the Cat,
yeah,
the way that I read that book is it's a much more kind of how would you say, refined path through some of the same questions.
Yes.
And it's quite a bit more reflexive, I think.
Yeah.
And when you
deliberate, it's much more deliberate.
And the prose changes too.
Yep.
The way the delivery of the prose.
Yep.
I think it's in some ways it seems more methodical to me.
It's more crafty.
Yeah. But when you decided to write that book, you had to explore again the legacy of the violence of the war.
Yeah.
Right. Which affected your family and also Kay, the person that you
Yeah.
wrote the story about. Can you tell me a little bit? Tell readers a little bit about how it is that you decided to write about Kay. What was so interesting about Kay as a person that drew you in to want to tell this story the way you did?
Well, so my sister, being older than me, had sort of dated the men who were Kay's sort of vintage and had come through that war experience. And one of the problems with having conscription when you're signing young men up at the age of 17, 18 years old is that becomes their education. Killing becomes, war is their university degree. They get a PhD in murder. And, I think what happened at the end of the war, which was when, as a Rhodesian, until the day of independence, white Rhodesians still thought the war was winnable, that it was impossible, that it was just going to end. And that it was a profound, it seems ridiculous living in an age of information as we do. And I think particularly young readers will have a hard time realizing we were in an information shutdown. All our newspapers were controlled by government. We didn't have access to any outside radio, and we weren't looking for it because we were on the side of freedom. And so when the end of the war came, it was a profound shock. And there was really very little done to coach those men back into how to behave in a peaceful way. And I think even if you do have counseling after a war, can you imagine, you don't undo those lies. So you told this boy, you're going to go out and fight for freedom. He has a gun. You absolutely have God's blessing for this. Off you go. Go and kill as many people as you can. The men go off, do as they're instructed, and suddenly they're being told, do you feel remorse for that? And they say, well, no, but they were my instructions. Why must I feel remorse for following an instruction? Yeah, but you had the best kill rate ratio in the army. Yeah, but that's a good thing, isn't it? And so these poor men, and they're boys, really, boys. So in a way, what I wanted to explore is how soldiers, they're the instruments of war, but they're not war's fault. They become a victim just as much as anyone else. And after the war, my father, I don't know, I really to this day do not know what he saw or did, and he won't talk about it, like a lot of men who've gone through war. But he pretty much didn't talk for 25 years, not a word. The most he would say was, well, I didn't really believe in the war, but I wasn't going to let somebody else do what needed to be done on my behalf. And then quite by happenstance, Kay was farming next to my parents. I met him, and unlike almost every other war vet I'd ever met, he not only talked about his war experience, you almost couldn't get him to stop talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he had reached a point of a profound need to speak up what had happened. He was living on a very isolated farm. You could only get to it by boat during the rainy season. The roads were impassable. No one could really get to him. It was a big effort for him to get out. I think that's the way he liked it. But I also think that the loneliness stirred a kind of madness in him, and the need to explain what had done. I mean, so you live with the silence of your guilt, or you speak it out.
Mm-hmm. Do you think he felt guilty about?
Yes, I do. I do. I don't think he would have put it into words like that, but I think he felt tremendous guilt, especially for, there's a scene in the book that's, actually the whole book sort of spins around the one scene where he is a very young lieutenant. He's in charge of a handful of young men. He's already lost 2 men in a previous accident during the war. It wasn't related to much of anything. A vehicle had turned over and crushed a boy. And he talked about how these young men, you could still see the white part of their neck where they'd had the soldier, the soldier haircut, and it's short, and so where they hadn't even had a chance to get sunburned on their new haircut, and he was a very young man. I mean, he couldn't have been much out of his teens, but he's got these 17-year-olds, and he just knew he was never going to face another mother or father and tell them that he had lost their son. And so his need to get information out of villagers, he took extreme measures and killed a woman. And I think he felt tremendous guilt over that.
Yeah, he killed her by torture.
Yes, yeah.
It was a long, bloody process.
Yeah.
And when you discussed that with him, when you were drawing the story out, and he was telling you that as a writer, one has to make decisions about how they're going to write a story like that.
Yeah.
And there's a presentation in the book, I think that I like, which is to say that it's not a very moralized account. It's almost a factual account of what happened. But then you do get at the deeper questions by when you turn the lens on yourself, and you talk about the effect of that story on you, and that somehow it doesn't lay blame on Kay because you explain it articulately. I think to say that that there was a threat, and it was an imminent threat, and if they didn't get the information, they were going to get killed. The group was
right.
By the guerrillas that were out there. But I think that when you decide to turn it back on you, then that shows the moral dimension of the story. Right? Is that did you think about like how you're going to do that? How you're going to tell
I sweated
it so
bullets,
moral,
right? I mean, I think that the thing is that I realized I was in hot water. Look, the whole book. I'm actually not sure that I really had the muscle to hold up the weight of that book, to be honest with you. It's, but at that time I had the courage. I think if I'd had more muscle, I'm not sure I would have had the courage, because it was a very brave decision, or at least it felt like it took all my courage to write it the way I did, which isn't to judge, because that, by judging, I think then the reader goes, oh, well, then she's all right because she thinks like I do, or whatever. But instead, if I just say, you know what, you turn a war on and atrocities will ensue. And if you are in any way responsible for that war, then you don't get to judge. Now, I had been a child during the course of that war, so you may say I was not responsible for it, and that seems certainly true, but I had benefited from being white in Rhodesia, and certainly had lived with the consequences of that war, and had a lot of questions. And one of the coincidences, I would guess, of Scribbling the Cat was that it came out roughly the same time that George W. Bush declared war in Iraq. And the paperback came out roughly the same time that the atrocities in Abu Ghraib were exposed. And my response was, you're surprised? I mean, you start a war and you're surprised when there's atrocities. Is killing a man not an atrocity? And so where do you go down from there? Of course there's torture, and it's unmentionable. It is unmentionable. And, you know, what we see, and I think the reaction to Scribbling the Cat shows this, is people are offended by Kay, people are offended by Lindy England. They're not offended by the politicians who started the war in the first place. Or if they are, it's a more sanitized, feeling. Well, Dick Cheney and George W. Bush, started this illegal war, but Lindy England was a vile, terrible person for taking orders. And there's a wonderful book out by Philip Gurevich about that that just came out now, and I think that's the question we really need to explore. These politicians start wars and they walk away with their squeaky clean hands, but I mean, it's just always sort of astonished me that you think that you can have rules of war.
Mm-hmm. No, I think the Scribbling Cat underlines that point very well. It says that there are rules, but they're not the kind of rules that you would like to have. Basically, it's total war.
Yeah, right.
The population.
Right. There's no in love and war. Forget it. And so, I wanted the reader not to have a morally comfortable place to sit, and I think readers who react strongly to the book one way or the other, but particularly readers who react negatively to it, are really getting that sense that but in my orderly world there's moral right and there's moral wrong. What I'm saying is that no, in war there are no there's no safe haven, there's no reliable witnesses, and everybody, to some extent, has guilt.
Did you consider yourself a war writer when you started these? Because these books, the first two books, are very much about war, right? And
so is the third book about war.
A different kind of war, though, I think.
Not really. It's about the war in Iraq, and how war becomes domestic. I mean, you can't... I would say that The Legend of Colton H. Bryant is about how even when you attack a foreign entity, domestically, that will resonate. So I would say all my books are about war. I would say I'm more of a pacifist than someone who wants to write about war. Mm-hmm. I would say that...
That's why I asked the question.
Yeah.
Last night you said that you're a pacifist.
Yeah.
But you've engaged pacifism with war. I mean, you brought war as the analytical lens.
Yes.
That helps you get to a different
place,
I think, by showing the trauma, the effect of violence on people.
Yeah. Well, I think war gets glorified, and we've seen this in Iraq. We see this, and then from the other side, I mean, if you were in Afghanistan and fighting on the other side of it, you're going to get glorified in the same way. And so for me, there's no glory here. There's no glory. Do you know what was absolutely do you know how there might be one book in your life that you read it and it absolutely tears your guts out and you're never the same after that? For me, I was about 14 years old when we did the poems of Wilfred Owen in English class, the First World War, and that dulce decorum est pro patria mori. It's a sweet and good thing to die for your country, and exactly those powerful images of these men, these young men who go in to fight for England and all the glory and all the rest of it, and it just ends up being a miserable carnage. And the fact that Wilfred Owen was killed before the end of the First World War, I just remember being appalled and shocked by that. Not even appalled and shocked. That's I guess what did it for me was I thought, here we are in 1914, 18, saying this, but look, how much have we learned? Here we are in the 70s and 80s still fighting a war. So I think as long as we insist on having wars, there need to be people who insist on writing about it honestly. But I could not bear the initial coverage when this country decided to go into Iraq was so unthoughtful. I mean, it was so jingoistic, and that doesn't change, and I think that's also
that's a terrible problem.
yeah.
one of the things that comes to mind when I'm thinking about this is when you're reflecting, when you're writing the Scribbling the Cat, you talk about exile a little bit. Like you mention it as like there's an anxiety about being in America. There's the anxiety is, you know, overfed people, Christmas parties, those kinds of things, and there seems to be a trivialization of life here that was so out of sync with what you were seeing in Africa, and so it compelled you even more. I think I'm just interpreting, but it seemed to compel you more to want to write that story.
Yeah.
Because you needed to make sense out of your own life, right? How you came to America, and then how. That's how I interpret it. Is that right? Is that you were in there's a certain amount of displacement going on because you had moved to the U.S. And I think that the way that I've read your work, which could be wrong, is that back and forth journey between Wyoming and Africa helped you work out who you've become and make you, I think, easier living in exile, if you want to call it that. I don't know if you'd call it exile, but what would you call it exactly?
Love. I fell in love with a Wyomingite, so that explains that. I mean, I think that's fair. I think, okay, so the great gift of being American is the comfort. It's also, and I think it's true that the great gift can also be your greatest curse.
Right.
That the majority of sort of middle-class Americans, and this is not true for a lot of Americans, but this is, again, an unspoken injustice, is that we're incredibly soft. I mean, it just shocked and astonished me that if you get a flat tire in this country, you call AAA. You're too pathetic to change your own tire on a car or really do much of anything for yourself. And there's just this kind of, this sense of entitlement that you are owed comfort and air conditioning and tremendous amounts of energy to keep one American body supported in a kind of neutralizing comfort, but it is neutralizing and neutering in a way. It takes away any sense of empowerment, and it creates, I think, great sense of fear. I mean, if you are so incapable of existing in the climate that you live in, I mean, literally the climate, let alone an ability to sort of feed yourself or, and look, this isn't true of all Americans, of course, but I think it's true of too many Americans that kind of softness leads to not just a softness in body, but mind and soul and spirit, and it becomes a very unquestioning belief in, you know, your superiority and I mean, I think that there is a untried sense of self. And it's not just the States. I mean, this is happening increasingly in the UK and so on. Whereas I do think Africa forces you to ask difficult questions. In Scribbling the Cat, I mean, it's a scene that really, of course, everything really happened that I wrote in the book, but you pick and choose what you put in. And you pick and choose what you put in for a reason, because I think there's a metaphor there, or it teaches a lesson, or it moves the story away and forward in some way. And there's a scene where Kay leaves me by the truck and he goes off for a walk in the bush, and two children come up that are starving and a little bit I don't know what the word is, but they're not being insolent, but they were being sort of amusing with me. And so they asked, do I have anything to feed them? So the only thing I could find to give them was some potato chips. And then I was smoking a cigarette, and they asked for cigarettes. And these kids were, 11, 12 years old. And I look at them, I go, no, I'm not going to give you a cigarette. And then I realized their life expectancy is almost zero. They're living without food. If there's one thing nicotine does, it suppresses an appetite. Who am I? I mean, the kids smoke. Now, what I say in the book is, I'm hoping that no one is sitting there in Wyoming giving my children potato chips and cigarettes. But the rules, it's not that the rules change, it's just that we have the comfort and ability to moralize about not giving your kids cigarettes and potato chips. And when you get to Africa, and until you've gotten to Africa, you're not in a position to judge what's appropriate and what isn't. And I think, and at the same time, I'm incredibly impatient with the leeway that African politicians are given of, well, that's Africa and they're doing the best they can, and it's a developing nation. And no, corruption is corruption. Abuse of power is abuse of power. So again, it's shades of grey. There's not one rule, this is black and white. Everything's in the great big huge soup of grey.
Mm-hmm. What about Mugabe? Like, how do you think about him as a ruler, and Zimbabwe and contemporary politics in Zimbabwe? How do you assess him?
Okay, so look, one of the first things Mugabe did when he came to power that everyone ignored because it was so inconvenient was he had a genocide. And people ignored that. 25 or 30,000 Ndebele people killed in the, let's see, in 84, 85, 86, 87. It was a profound war against the people that he was ruling. I found that very troubling, that this could go on, and even people in Zimbabwe, because the majority of Zimbabweans are Shona speaking, and Shona ignored it, that this was going on in Ndebele land. It's in the southern part of the country, and it was just too inconvenient to challenge what Mugabe was doing. So he got going long ago on this. But as long as people were comfortable, and the majority of Zimbabweans were, they didn't want to look at it, they didn't want to rock the boat. And I think that's where, that's where there becomes this sort of creep of violence. And then Mugabe did things like, he sent a significant number of troops into the Congo to support Laurent Kabila, but really to support his diamond interests there. Again, everyone who was comfortable kept their mouths shut. Well, that was the beginning of the end. He couldn't afford that war. It was millions of dollars every day. So when those soldiers came back from the war and he was under generals and he was unable to pay them, he said, you know what, I don't have money for you, but go and take yourself a farm. Well, that was the beginning of the so-called land reforms, and from there, chaos and anarchy ensues. But I think if people had been awake and alert, and the West had they were cheering Mugabe on. He was accepted everywhere in the world. He was committing a genocide.
But he was also approached and kind of favored by South African politicians too.
Absolutely.
Mandela,
Yep.
Mbeki,
Yep.
so on.
Yep.
They seem to be unwilling
Yep.
to.
Kenneth Kaunda.
They didn't like criticizing him because he had been one of their advocates.
Well, and also there's Sam and Jumo is also in that sort of group, and I think one of the things that happened, well, with Mbeki especially, is that there had been a group of freedom fighters that had come out of that first wave of independence, Kayonza and so on, and that Zimbabwe only got its independence much later, and so, but Mugabe had been thrown in jail and exiled and so on, and he had really paid for his opposition to the white government, and so there was a kind of brotherhood of those people who had paid for their opposition to apartheid or their opposition to colonialism with incarceration or sometimes with their lives and with tremendous violence. And so they supported Mugabe, but then there was a bit of an embarrassment, I think, for someone like Mbeki, who had not been imprisoned or incarcerated, or he had been in exile, but he hadn't really had to go through some of the hideous, violent, repercussions of opposing apartheid. And so I think for him, there was a sort of unquestioned, if you were in the brotherhood of the people who opposed the white regime, then your policies weren't deeply questioned.
But it was uncomfortable for him because people were asking him to say something.
It was uncomfortable for
Mbeki because there was a lot of criticism about his position, because South Africa came to represent something else,
right?
At the end of apartheid, something higher in a sense. I think, and that association with Mugabe continued to kind of deflower that image.
Well, what became very difficult for Mbeki is that Mugabe is very well supported within South Africa by ordinary South Africans. Mugabe is considered a hero, regardless of what he did in Matabeleland, and regardless of the policies that have driven his countrymen over the border to South Africa.
What about for the whites who stayed in Zimbabwe, today's Zimbabwe? What is their life like? Like those people who stayed as kind of former settlers, now citizens in a very kind of threatened environment. I mean,
look, I think that we get very caught up with this question of white and black, and I think it's irrelevant. I think that there's a point at which a country deteriorates to the point that doesn't matter what color you are. You may stand out more as a white person, so you may get a little more persecuted from that point of view, especially if you're landed. Other than that, it's pretty much a nightmare for everybody. And I think, to begin with, Mugabe really was able to deflect any kind of criticism. And this country, the West in general, are so queasy about addressing the issue of race because they have not addressed their own issues of racism within, the UK and the US particularly has such an uncomfortable relationship with race and really so many unresolved issues. And so I think that they were very reluctant to meddle with, what Mugabe was doing early on, because he threw the red herring out that this was about white landed settlers versus, the indigenous population of Zimbabwe. Not that it was a question of corruption and power.
Do you think of yourself when you write about these things, and even in your kind of historical work, do you think of yourself as an African or American? How do you think of yourself?
I used to. I mean, you should read some of the early interviews, and I'm so insisting on being an African, violently insisting that I'm an African. And then I heard Cindy Sheehan, the peace activist, the American peace activist, and she was being interviewed by the BBC. Owen Bennett-Jones was interviewing her, and he asked her if she was a patriot, and because she was camping outside George W. Bush's ranch in Texas and protesting the war in Iraq. And he said, well, do you consider yourself a patriot? And she said, no, I consider myself a matriot. And Owen Bennett-Jones squeaked in a sort of British way. He was so shocked. And he said, what does that mean? And she said, what that means is, if you're a patriot, you believe that the children born of your country deserve all the privileges and rights and protection. But if you're a matriot, you believe in the freedom and protection for all children across borders. And I remember exactly where I was listening to that interview, and I just stopped in my tracks and thought, that's truly what I am. I don't believe that Zimbabweans deserve more privileges than South Africans. I don't believe that the US deserves to have 25% of the world's energy. I don't believe that I am any more precious or protectable than an Iraqi citizen. Therefore, I'm a matriot. And I would say, yes, I have an American passport now, but I don't know if my sensibilities are necessarily American. I don't know, and I don't care. I try and I'm no less likely to question the policies of my country, just because I have the passport for that. And this is a tricky thing, because I think this culture that we grow up in really promotes a kind of blind patriotism and almost fervent, and that if you don't say that you're proud to be American, look what happened to Michelle Obama. And yet I think it's perfectly acceptable to say, well, there's certain conditions and situations in this country that I find appalling, really appalling. There's a great amount of injustice here. Does that make me unpatriotic? And frankly, I don't care.
Yeah. No, I share the same sentiment. When you think about, I'm just thinking about yourself as a writer. Do you think of yourself as a post-colonial writer? Are you comfortable with that term?
I don't care.
Post-colonial.
I don't care.
Because some people might say you're a post-colonial writer. Does it mean anything to you?
Nothing.
Nothing. Because it's a label, or because you're just not interested in post-colonialism?
Because it's a label.
Okay.
And I think labels are really limiting.
Right.
I think if I'm a post-colonial writer, well, then what does that make the legend of Colton H. Bryant? So no, I mean, and I think that for a long time, however, I marched around with these labels attached to me. Here were my labels. I was a liberal, vegetarian, feminist, environmentalist. And what I realized is even going around with labels that I saw as positive greatly limited my ability to see beyond the labels. So what were the 4,000 million things that I couldn't be because I was attached to these 4 labels of myself? And so really trying to be more open to the conditions that I found and without judgment. I think that is truly the role of a writer.
When you began to shed the labels, did it change your writing?
Yes.
How?
So there's a great story. This is when I shed the labels. So I was stuck up on an assignment in Montana in this remote corner of the state. And
where? I'm from Montana.
Yeah, up near Glacier.
Okay.
And I did, by some miracle, have internet access. And so I was listening to This American Life on my computer. Ira Glass, that fabulous program out of Chicago. And the topic of that interview was lockup. And he was interviewing Breitenbach, the great South African poet, who was incarcerated for 7 years for his opposition to apartheid. And Breitenbach talks about being in the prison in, I believe it's Pretoria, they called Beverly Hills, which was the prison where they killed political prisoners. They hanged them. And so the central place in this prison was the hanging chamber. And Breitenbach, all the prisoners were isolated in their cells. So the only way they could communicate with one another was to sing to each other. And Breitenbach talks about how, what you could hear every couple of days was the tremendous clang of somebody being hanged, the trapdoor going, the shudder going throughout the jail. And even if you're in isolation, somehow information leaks around, doesn't it? So people would always know when someone was due to be hanged, that maybe they only had a day or 2 left to live. And he talked about how the night before a person was due to be hanged, only that person would sing. And how you could really actually feel the quality of listening in the jail change. People ached, strained to hear the last song of the condemned man. And I would say that when I lost or got rid of my labels, the quality of my listening changed.
What did you hear differently?
I think that what I heard without the muting effects of my judgment was that there are several different truths here, but that really all men and all women seek, I think, for a sense of justice, for their basic human rights to be upheld, and for respect. And I think what I'm finding working, so I spent several years out on the oil patch of Wyoming, and what I found there is that the men and women working on the rigs are considered by corporate America just basically a heartbeat that you throw at a rig, and what you're really after are the minerals. Wyoming has the highest worker fatality rate in the nation, but we also kill rig workers at the highest rate in the nation. Off the charts, almost double than anyone else in the country. But there's no attempt on behalf of Wyoming's politicians to slow that trend. There is no urgency on behalf of the oil companies who are exempt from any kind of liability to change that trend. And so for me, I think, going out there, it's that going out there and really listening to people's stories. What I, started to hear was that I think people have a basic sense of when injustice is ensuing.
When you start to, so you shed the labels like during this, in between second and third book, or right around that time, the second book? Is it happening then? The reason I ask is because
I think they started to, I think it started during Scribbling the Cat, which was that I realized I wasn't Rhodesian, I wasn't Zimbabwean, I wasn't particularly African. And in order to write that honestly about the war, I had to really step back. I mean, you can't write about a war like that and still have patriotic hang-ups and that kind of thing.
Yeah, because I mean, textually, when you analyze the text, it seems to me, because I think it's a profound text. It's my favorite book of yours, and it's one of my favorite books of all time. And it's because there's something happening in it it's the distance. There's a kind of reflective distance that's in that book that I think is really, really important, because there are so many books about colonialism and decolonization that are the moralistic account of war, right? And there's a moral, but it's not moralizing.
Right.
And I think that's a very, very, very powerful style of writing, but at the same time, it tends to foster enemies.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm wondering what the reaction was on the part of your friends first, and then the media. How did you receive?
I think my friends are embarrassed by the book. Because it's a deeply raw piece of writing, very, and we're not used to that. We are used to saying, well, but here I am. Yeah, as a feminist, I'm going to say this. As a African American, I'm going to take this stand. So you see everything through this narrow lens of what you are. As a white American woman, I'm going to see this. God, we saw it during this election, this latest election thing. People were so busy slapping labels on themselves. By the end of it, you couldn't even see what they looked like. And I think it, in the end, had a crippling effect, certainly for McCain and Palin. They were so busy covering themselves with labels, no one could hear what they were saying. And I think that, but it's uncomfortable. We like things neatly labeled, put in a box, and then it's not as dangerous. It's not as hot to handle, and we don't have to look at it if we don't want to. If it's a label that we think might be frightening for us, well, then we don't look in that box. Well, what do you do with a piece of writing that refuses to label itself anything? And it makes it very uneven ground for people. So I think my friends were a bit embarrassed. So a handful of people whom, I'm thinking of the writer Terry Tempest Williams, who writes primarily her books are sort of set in Utah in the West. For her, it was her favorite book of mine, for the very same reasons that you quote. She felt this tremendous sense of discomfort reading it. She read it while she was in Rwanda, and her latest book is set partially in Rwanda, but she loved it for that very reason, that when you go to Rwanda, which has just experienced hideous genocide and so on, the sense of wrong and right and black and white is so blurry. And for her, that book, so she found a place that made her feel less insane, because the book's so insane, that the two went together. You don't feel like you're reading something and, how awful to go to Rwanda and to be reading a book that maybe would say, but there are black and white answers here. It would make you feel crazy, because that's not the experience on the ground. I think there was a lot of confusion about how it should be read. I think especially in this country, where people are used to a kind of Jerry Springer debate, that it's all about sort of tell-all, and that this was really about my marriage, or about a relationship with a soldier. I mean, they really, I think, a very shallow reading of the book.
No, that makes sense, because there's a confessional model that's in place in literature. Yeah. And it's a tell-all, release your soul.
Right, and I think that's, if you plug that book into a confessional model, I can imagine it would feel like a train wreck. So I don't know. I think that I also think that there's an interesting component, which is that people often ask me, well, what did your husband think, and that kind of thing. But my response is, well, did anyone ask Ernest Hemingway what his wives thought of his work? And I do think it's a bit sexist. I think that men would have gotten away with writing something like that, and
I'm not sure today's men would. I think the wives might question in the same way. I think that my response would be that there's an equal partnership in a marriage, and that each side might do the same thing. But I understand.
I'm not sure. I'm really not. I have to say, I'm not sure about that. I think that as women, you're more. First of all, I'm stepping into men's territory, which is war, and soldiers, and so I think there was. I do think there was a little bit of wrist slapping there. I don't know. It was just the feeling I got, which was that, there was an awful lot about, I think this is true. I don't think you can get away from it. Women are one of two things. You're either the angel in the attic or the mad woman. Yeah. And it's very, very hard to be. Look at the way that Hillary Clinton was treated in this election cycle, and I think it took even her by surprise. Right. The level of chauvinism. And Nancy Pelosi, she's described as shrill. Come on, it's a strong word, and I think it has connotations that sort of resonate with us in some way. And I think I think this is one of the things that we are, want to believe that we've overcome, but I don't think we have.
Well, one of the things I like about your book is your books is you have very elaborate discussions of masculinity in it. You seem to be.
I know, isn't that interesting? So for a feminist, I write about men. Well, primarily.
That's a legitimate topic, right? Some feminists would argue that men shouldn't write about women, which I think is ridiculous. But
right, absolutely. And so, and what's more extraordinary is it's not really a choice. I mean, I would say "Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight" is more about my mother,
right.
But the themes are very masculine, and there's an awful lot of men in the book. But I think that's war. I think that's growing up in Southern Africa. I think it's war. And I think when I grew up, men had all the power. My father didn't believe that women should have the vote, nor did he also believed it was a waste of money to educate women. And he's been a little bit sort of, I mean, he would now say, well, you're different. That's what he would say to me. It's not that all women are different, just you're different. And then Wyoming's the same way. I mean, I cannot tell you how many people refer to me as that gal, and which is fine, but it's not very respectful. And or that woman. I mean, I get called that woman a lot. People don't really. And what right do I have to be talking about roughnecks? I'm, a woman, and I should keep my criticism to the kitchen, kind of thing. And so I think that when we, as women, start to explore themes that are masculine and muscular, it gets us into, I think, an interesting territory.
Well, I think it opens it up.
Yeah,
personally, because
of course.
You're approaching it from a different angle.
Yeah.
And you're thinking about masculinity different than a man might, or maybe the same. I'm not sure if you can define it that way, but one of the things that
well, you know what? I think as a woman, you're less likely to be competitive with the masculinity. So you're more likely to
analyze it. Maybe.
Yeah, perhaps, and to be affected by it. Maybe.
Yeah, because when I was telling you last night, when I read your descriptions of Kay, right, there's the one page where it's just one of the most beautiful things I've ever read, when you describe him as in cathedral in an African Vatican City. That's one of the most effective descriptions of masculinity I've ever seen.
Do you know what's so funny? I remember this review because my publicist in England tried to keep it from me. It was so horrendous. That exact section that you're talking about was excerpted in the review, or talked about in this review, where this man said that I'd had multiple orgasms in my writing over this. That was just the most horrendous piece of writing he had ever experienced, and that.
That's pretty offensive.
It was, and that's why I'm talking about this. When you're a woman and you perhaps celebrate masculinity, they assume that it's sexual, not, which it was never with Kay.
Right.
So, whereas if a man had written that, perhaps they would have said, "Oh, what an extraordinary description of manhood, and how brave of this man to write about men in this way." But if you do it as a woman, they assume that it's. That there's a sort of sensuality there that, of course, exists. I mean, there's nothing wrong, I think, with writing about sensuality or sexuality in that way. It doesn't necessarily mean that the author, and it doesn't matter what the author's feeling, frankly. I think that's irrelevant. But
what do you think, just more generally, the role of the writer today? Where do you situate writers in today's marketplace of ideas, or the role that writers have, the responsibility of writing?
Well, I think that now that, especially that newspapers have folded left, right, and center, that more than ever, writers really are the mirror to our world. That it's incumbent upon us to look at the stories, especially the stories that aren't being spoken about. I mean, the great thing about growing up in Rhodesia and then Zimbabwe and then Zambia was that I found that the very thing that we weren't allowed to talk about was the one thing that we should be talking about. For example, before independence, there was apartheid, but it was illegal to speak about it. We didn't have freedom of speech, for one thing, but it was absolutely forbidden to question. Oh, so wait, hang on, why are 11 million black people not given the land, the schools, the hospitals, the sidewalks, the restrooms, the votes? And then after independence, when the genocide was happening, it was forbidden to mention it. Absolutely forbidden. It was a way to get yourself or everyone around you hurt or killed, or thrown in prison or out of the country. So what I grew up understanding is that if there is a big subject and no one's talking about it, that's the very thing we need to be discussing. And so, for me in Wyoming, living in Wyoming, for the 6 years straight, we have the highest worker fatality in the nation. Guess what? No one's talking about it. Political cycle after political cycle, talking about everything else except for worker fatality. But it's the one thing that we do, better or worse than anyone else in the nation. Why aren't we talking about it? Well, it turns out we're not talking about it because so many of the legislatures are so deep in the pockets of oil and gas that it's a very uncomfortable subject for them to broach. And so for me as a writer, that's where we need to be looking.
Do you think it was the censorship of the colonial era that made you think about breaking those taboos?
Yeah, absolutely.
The kind of move away from
and look,
self-censorship?
there is self-censorship that's just as, in fact, if anything, it's worse. And the profoundly muting effect of money and power.
And the effect of violence, too, on a lot of writers. I think I've done the reason I ask is a lot of writers have said that part of the reason they're engaging some of these questions is they're trying to break that
taboo
self-censorship.
Yeah.
Because that's probably the most deadly of all the...
Of course.
Because you internalize.
Of course. Well, look, if Scribbling the Cat doesn't do that, then I don't know what does. I mean, it's the most self-censorship breaking book that I've certainly been... more, I mean, I don't know if I'd have the guts to do that again. So thank goodness I did it when I did.
What are you working on now? What kind of project?
Well, I'm writing another book about my mother, actually. And in part, what I realized, especially working on Colton H. Bryant, I came at the book, The Legend of Colton H. Bryant, through my environmental concerns, actually, what the oil companies were doing to clean air, clean water, wildlife migration corridors, that kind of thing. But what I couldn't ignore were the obituaries that were piling up while I was doing the research for that work. And so I sort of had this epiphany, I guess, that, until we took care of our brothers, until we repaired our relationships with each other, it's going to be very, very difficult to fight for other basic rights, clean water, clean air, and migration corridors. I mean, if oil companies can be killing workers at the highest rate in the nation, it seems a little bit disingenuous to be trying to hold their feet to the fire for also polluting our water. Let's just take care of our brothers first, and then other things will begin to fall into place. And as I'm fighting for this, and I'm in the Wyoming legislature advocating for safer rigs, and really fighting for the legislature to change the law so that the oil companies are not exempt from maiming or killing roughnecks. They're not exempt from liability. What I realized in the back of my sort of mind was that I had not really repaired my relationships with my mother, nor have I done anything to explain how in a post-colonial world, people like my parents have taken enormous strides, as have the people they lived with, to step away from the colonial era and to begin to work together in a way that has been, I think, transformative in a country like Zambia, where I would say it truly is a post-colonial society now, or at least getting there. I mean, I can envision a time, maybe not my generation, but perhaps the children that are coming up now, where it won't matter what color you are to get elected into office in Zambia. And that would be enormously, to get truly beyond race.
Do you think that your relationship, you have a daughter, right?
Yeah, 2 daughters and a son.
Do you think your relationships with your children, as a mother, is helping you think about your relationship with your mother?
Absolutely.
Like, what's the lens?
Of course. Well, I mean, I think that you, for one thing, I have so much compassion for my mother, considering she lost 3 children. I think I lost one, I would be undone. I mean, there's no way I would have continued to get up in the morning. So I think there's that. And secondly, I think that you find yourself, at least I have found myself really questioning, okay, so I've used to be just critical of my mother for her politics, that she was pro-apartheid and that, and she would fight for Ian Smith's side and so on and so forth. But having had children, I can see it through a different lens, which is that I actually think she was fighting to protect us, to hold on to her land, to fight for what she thought was her right and the rights of her children. Was it misguided? Yeah, I believe it was. But did it come from the same place as my basic instincts do? Yes. And so I think that's where it gets confusing, and that's where it feels so right and so just and so sort of righteous, is, you're fighting for your children or your rights, but if you forget that so James P. Cass has wrote that great book, Finite and Infinite Games, and he says there's only two kinds of games. There's a finite game in which the rules are you begin here and at the end there's a winner and a loser, or there's an infinite game where the only rule of play is to keep the game going, and so there are no winners. Now if you look at any of our society, if you look at our culture, if you look at the way Rhodesia was, it was winner takes all. You either win or you lose. There's no in between. That's it. So much of what we do in the United States of America is finite game. We play football. There's a winner or there's a loser, and that's it. The winners are elated, the losers go home and they're so depressed or the war in Iraq, there's winners or losers. Afghanistan, winners or losers. But what about the infinite game, and I think that changes absolutely everything. And I think that but I think the impulse in both is the same. It's just a decision of do I want to be the winner, or do I want everyone to win, so that the game never ends. And if you think about it, environmental activism is probably the most sort of profound example of the infinite game. But if you become a violent environmental activist, then it's a finite game.
Do you think that when people look at you as an activist, because you're certainly an activist now, if you're going to the legislature and trying to promote legislation to curb the influence of the oil and gas sectors, what's the reaction from that group to you? As a writer, do they think you're imposing yourself?
Who?
The people who have vested interest in preserving the oil as it is, etc.
I don't know, and I really don't care. I mean, I think if we limit ourselves because we've decided we're quote unquote a writer, that's just one way of them saying, let's find a reason to shut her up. Oh, she's a writer. I mean, I actually think that the role of, to go back to an earlier question, one of the roles of writers is you can't dig up some hideous injustice and then not speak out about it. And I'm thinking of Food Inc. and the work that's been done there. I mean, here you have people who started to explore the role of food in America, who saw tremendous injustice and who have taken that to an activist role and expanded it and become educators about it and so on. I think that's, more and more what we need to be doing.
I'm reading a book called The Omnivore's Dilemma.
Yeah. Michael Pollan, and he's involved in Food Inc. and yeah.
So when you assess your work, your current work is on reflecting again about your mother again. Does your mother know that?
Yes.
What does she think this?
She's all right with it. She hasn't read it yet.
Are you interviewing her for it?
I am. Yeah, which has been interesting because I didn't interview her for Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight. It's also about, repairing our relationships. Let's go all the way back to slavery is what I'm saying. Let's go back even before the colonial era. And let's look at that. Let's talk about it. And I'm not sure it's something that we should forgive. And I certainly believe it's not something we should forget. But we do need to find a way to live with it and move on. Because the sins of the fathers will be visited upon the children. That much has been clear. I mean, the influence of slavery on both this country and on continental Africa has been tremendous. And the wounds of that hideous trade. And not that the slave trade's over by any stretch of the imagination, but I think as long as we can't find a way to all of us live with it again, but I think it means we have to accept responsibility for it, accept the truth of it, accept the horror of it, and accept that the burden for it wasn't just the consumers, that the people who engaged in the slave trade in Africa were just as culpable, and there's something really devastating about the fact that so many of the chiefs sold their own people into slavery willingly.
Do you believe in reconciliation as like a policy, a national policy, or how do you think about for example, the South African model of reconciliation?
I think it has to happen on a micro level. I think it has to happen in the schools, and I think it has to happen in homes. I don't think it can be imposed from the top down. I think it has to be more organic than that. I don't think it hurts to have a policy of it, but I don't think it can be imposed.
Do you think something like reconciliation would be possible in Zimbabwe?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I suppose anything's possible.
What would it look like if they did it?
I know, I was just flashing back to what that would be, and I couldn't really see it. Yeah, I don't know.
No, the reason I ask is it seems to me that your book is, The Scribbling the Cat,
Yeah.
is a kind of reconciliation, right? It's a reconciliation first, in my appraisal, right? Of you working through your own
Yeah.
past, your father's past,
Yeah.
right? And your father's peers' past. And then there is a bit of a question at the end of how do you deal with this? And I think the end of that book is absolutely brilliant when you talk about love and this is the effect of war. And you say very succinctly that this is an analysis of the effect of war on people, and it's not a judgmental one, but it's kind of it's showing the elements of the trauma in play. And I think that if you were to take that kind of approach where you admit guilt on both sides.
Well, Alexandra Kanengoni did it with Echoing Silences, and he really was the model for that book was the model for Scribbling the Cat, and I quote it in the book twice and actually dedicate the book to Kanengoni. I mean, I think he really showed the way forward, and that took such courage and such soul. I really believe that. But it's what's been so interesting to me is Dambadzo Marachera, for example, who wrote The House of Hunger, which is very critical of, look, those of us who refuse to sort of celebrate, independence, for example, were ostracized. I mean, it wasn't as if Marachera was exactly embraced by Zimbabweans for what he was doing. It was just too complicated. So I do think that reconciliation is in part a breaking open of the myths that we have that allow us to live with ourselves and our pasts. And do I think that that's all it looks like? No, I think that it depends. I mean, I'm a writer, so my attempt at reconciliation is to try and be very honest about, what happened, right? And to say, well, and in order to move on, we really have to forgive the soldiers on either side. Maybe not the politicians, but we do need to forgive the soldiers. But what does that look like if you're a teacher? Well, then you teach differently. What does it look like if you're a nurse? I mean, I think it is about finding that kind of deeper, sort of universal truth in yourself.
Do you think that the people that you were in school with, your former schoolmates, what do they think about your books?
Well, it's interesting. They see that through the lens of whatever they believe in. So if they sort of consider themselves, quote unquote, Rhodesians, which is that they sort of unapologetically white, then they feel like it's a celebration of their childhood. If they consider themselves Zimbabweans, some find it very racist that it was a very white point of view, and that there should have been more black voices in the book, which for me would have been disingenuous, because the whole point of apartheid was that the black Zimbabweans didn't have a voice. So for me to put black voices in there would have been an enormous lie. And then, for people who are a bit more thoughtful on either side, they feel as if it really is an expose of that kind of cozy racism that existed, that allowed apartheid to happen, the unthinking ability to believe in your politicians. You unthinkingly follow their policies. I tell you what, if nothing else, growing up in that system makes me very suspicious of politicians, but extremely suspicious when people start throwing the word freedom around. It definitely sets off alarm bells in my head.
Well,
and Chenjerai Hovey said to me, we were speaking together in Las Vegas on a panel of African writers, and of course they always have 6 Nigerians and then me, But the Nigerian writers have so sort of taken over the kind of voice right now. But Chenjerai Ihovi was on that panel, and somebody asked him how it felt for him to be, you know, there with me, or what he thought about my work, something like that. And he said, well, her work makes my work the truth. In other words, if I've been writing about the white atrocities, but then we read books written by white people who say, well, actually we were liberals and we really were nice to our servants, and you know, he goes, well, that's then what I'm saying is a lie, whereas what she's written is absolutely makes my work the truth. And so he said that Doris Lessing, her work did the same thing, which I really think it did. That fabulous The Grass is Singing really spoke about the quiet violence of apartheid and oppression, the way that it could even manifest as a kind of ennui.
Do you see yourself in, do you read people like Coetzee?
Yes, yeah.
It's very similar to me in some ways. I mean, the boyhood, he's describing about what it's like to grow up in South Africa. When you think about yourself as an African writer, if you do, right?
Yeah, which I don't.
Other works to see how they try to describe similar phenomena or processes?
No. I mean, was I influenced by The Grass is Singing? I don't see how I couldn't have been. It was such an amazing book, Doris Lessing's book. Was I influenced by Echoing Silences? Yeah, I mean, it shook my entire world. But I was just as influenced by Michael Ondaatje, for example, who I thought brought a kind of poetic soul to his work without judgment. I was just as influenced by James Galvin, who very few people sort of read his work. The Meadow, which is a book about land in Wyoming and Colorado. It's a book about the love of land. I was influenced by, Ngugi and the way that his writing was activism. And the way that Ngugi, in spite of everything he's gone for, is still such a forgiving human being. I was influenced by Mandela's politics. He came out of years of incarceration with a message of peace. Was it perfect? No, he's not perfect. But who is? And I think that what he tried to do was so groundbreaking in terms of a sort of reconciliation after that, years and years of, since 1948, years of institutionalized racism.
When you go back to Wyoming,
yeah,
right? What do you do in Wyoming, like day to day? What's a day look like?
I write a lot, and then at some point in the day I take the dogs out for a walk. I have 3 children, so occasionally I have to remember to feed them or do. I am famous for leaving my kids at places because I get caught up writing, and my children have now just learned that they just need to get in the vehicle of the nearest friendly person and be driven home because it's not going to happen.
How many hours a day do you write?
It depends what's going on. For Colton H. Bryant, I wrote probably 16 hours a day straight. But
for a year or so?
3 months.
How many drafts?
2.
Yeah.
Which doesn't mean there aren't thousands of, you know how that is. Computers really ruin that for you. You've done drafts and drafts and drafts by the time you're finished, but I would say that was really done in 2 drafts. By the time I come to a story, I'm usually very clear. I usually get something profoundly wrong or absolutely right. There's no... I do most of my thinking outside. I have a horse.
Right.
I take her out in the mountains a lot, and I pretty much get things, as lined up as I can and as tight as I can. And by the time I sit down at my computer, it needs to be, very, very clear. So yeah, I write a lot.
Is it therapy?
No, therapy's therapy.
More torture than therapy?
Yeah, probably, yeah.
Do you benefit from discussions with other writers? Do you try to hang out with other writers too?
Terry Tempest Williams is a very close friend, and she's, I would say I benefit from her ferocity and her dedication to sort of truth. And then I have a very close friend in Philadelphia who's a writer, and I benefit from his muscularity. He is absolutely ruthless. He's also a big fan of my work, which I think helps. He's a fan, and he's so impatient when he sees that I've written something that's less than perfect.
Do you share your work with many people? Or
No, just those 2.
since I teach your work, right? I've been trying to develop websites so people can use interviews in courses. So
Oh, what a brilliant idea.
Yeah, online. So my idea is to create an oral history archive of all the interviews, so people will have access to these writers.
Wow.
And then use it as a teaching tool. So when somebody's teaching your work, they can go to this and see an interview with you. And then you can, it's really helpful for students. So I've already used a lot of these in my courses.
Yeah.
And students really like it because they get to
Yeah.
see you, they get,
Yeah.
it's that question of agency. The writer speaks for themselves rather than a writer speaking for a writer.
I also think I'm so unexpected. I mean, not so much from Scribbling the Cat, but when people read Don't Let's Go with the Dogs Tonight, they expect to meet a victim or something, and really I'm quite fierce.
Right.
And
No, I know that. It's very... Okay, keep an eye on that. Okay,
it's
all right.
very scarily obvious.
Okay, good, thanks.
Geez, I think we got her done.
Yeah.